First of all, we are addressing movements in times of crisis, which I will say are movements that to a certain extent, given social movement type of theories, should not exist, because should be movements without opportunities and resources. We are looking also at movements in exceptional times, and there are also moments in which movements emerge very much as processes in which resources are constructed through the protest rather than the other way around. And this is something which is part of the narratives of the movement since 2011. One of the, challenge in reflecting on this moment is that we have at the same time to reflect on the structures and the transformations in the structural context of the movements, but also things in terms of agency. Things in terms of movement spirits is a term which emerged a lot in analyzing Gezi parks, thinking about how short moments of mobilizations can imply a lot in terms of producing subjectivities, of producing the emergence of movements. I want to start with the concept of neoliberalism because I think it's a way in which I can address the questions of the relationship between political economy and social movements. And thinking in terms of ways in which different transformations in capitalism are to be considered in order to understand some characteristics of nowadays movements. And I think that in reflection in political economies, that there is work by some scholars that we can go back to in order also to address some of the questions that were mentioned today, which is which type of conflicts are there in the societies and which type of challenges are there for progressive politics in the need to reconstitute the concept of class, which are the classes which are on the making, and especially which is the relationship between transformations in the social structures and the emergence of the class per se, of a consciousness, of an identities, and so on. I think that still when we think about neoliberalism, Polanyi's visions of the first great transformations, the first moment in which liberalism tended to develop, he was working on the 19th century Great Britain, are interesting in order to address movements nowadays, because he was talking about the constant move between movements and counter-movements, where for movements he intended something different from what we intend in social movement studies, but something relevant for reflection on capitalism, because he said, thinking about the first great transformations, that there are moments in which free markets become dominant, and that these moments are resisted by movements who try to go back to social protection. Buraway, I think it's interesting for us because he singles out in this moment in time evolutions of struggles that are at the same time against commodification, as they were in the past. So struggles, for instance, against privatizations, which are very typical of the wave of protest which started already in the beginning of the millennium, but started even earlier on in Latin America. But he says there are also struggles against decommodifications, precarity, for instance, which is one of the main challenge for citizens, but also for social movements, and then for social movement scholars to address. Together with Polanyi and Buraway, I think it is also interesting in order to reflect about the political economy transformations which have an impact on social movements, about David Harvey's approach to neoliberalism as a moment in which the characteristics of primitive accumulations are again relevant. So accumulations by dispossessions is what Harvey defines, is conditions in which people are deprived from most type of citizenship rights. I think that all these type of transformations in the social structures of the protest have played a role in the development of the social movements of 2011. And I think that the important element is that then all these were transformed into a social crisis, which is the crisis that social movements are reacted to. So what I mean is that is not just the abstract transformations in capitalism that is at stake, but it is a very direct attack on the everyday life of the people. And what we know from social movement studies is that people react to concrete developments, disrupting their everyday life. The crisis was also very deeply what I call a crisis of responsibility, let's say a sort of legitimacy crisis, because it was produced and reproduced through a transformations of the state. So it's not just capitalism which changed, but political economy approach. So I pointed the interactions between the market and the state. And what you found in the crisis mobilized is neoliberal policies, which meant reduced competencies for the state, deregulation, liberalizations, and privatizations, and then austerities were the main type of policies which were mobilized in Europe and elsewhere, which produced the crisis and then reproduced it. And this took very specific characteristics in the European Union, for instance, because in the European Union, the way in which the crisis was addressed meant a strengthening of the type of neoliberal approach, mixed also with strong challenges towards that representative democracy. So think about the moment of the crisis with the Grexit. Decisions making was not at all in the hands of the parliaments, of the European parliaments, and not even the European commissions, but it was the European Central Bank. And it was ECOFIN. And it was all those institutions that are so untransparent. They were institutions which were created on the basis of conceptions of monetarism, orthodox type of interventions, reductions of the power of the states, giving back everything to the market. And so this strengthened this type of evolutions. The ways in which the European Union addressed this was also through the impositions of memorandums of understanding in some cases. And these memorandums of understandings were particularly critical in terms of reflecting on representative democracies, because the European Union imposed the signature to both the oppositions and the governments. So it abolished democratic dialectic inside. One of the Spanish slogans was lo llaman democracia y no lo es. They call it democracy, but it is not. So I think all this changed that at the European Union were most visible, but then were reflected in multi-level governance also at the domestic level, reduced the possibilities of using the various mechanism of accountability. And they were reflected in a very drastic drops on trust in national parliaments. This is an incredible drop, because it is in some cases from 60% to 20%. is a dramatic drop in trust in political parties, which reached in some of these countries, especially Spain and Greece, but I also have statistics about Italy. In Italy, trust in political parties, it's at 3%. 3% is the statistical error, so it is possible also that it is zero. I mentioned Polanis, and Polanis, like counter-movements, have, I think, some characteristics of the movements of the 2011. Polanyi expected movements that were defending previously existing rights. In fact, Polanyi's approach is similar to approaches like E.P. Thompson and those who looked at food riots or other forms of resistance against primitive accumulations, pointing at the fact that people were not reacting just to being hungry because the price of the bread was increasing, but they were also angry because they thought that the previous social pact had been betrayed. And so the moral dimensions of this movement. And I think that the movements we are addressing also bring the focus so much on moral issues, on the attack against the corruption of the elite, also to a certain extent because what they feel is that the previously existing social pacts, which was a pact not only in democracy, but it was the pact of the developmental state, the pact of the so-called second world of real socialism and so on, which was granting a modicum of social, civic, and political rights, is challenged nowadays. And so I think that some of the characteristics of the movements that we have been analyzing are indeed characterized by this type of defense of rights. The book, I think, also had these aspects, the mobilizations of the trade unions very often as these aspects. The mareas in Spain also have these characteristics, trying to defend public services from the continuous commodifications, trying to defend people against the big expulsions, which is also expulsions from rights to work, rights to have a house, and so on. I think that there what was clear was we want to defend the old rights, but we want also to invent something which goes beyond the alternative between the public and the private. In Italy, we had the referendums against austerities, which develop on the ideas of the need to develop or revitalize the concept of the commons. So the ideas that beyond the private and the public, there are some goods that have to be, managed by the citizens. So not by the elected or by the administrations, but with the participations of the citizens, sort of reconstructions of a social welfare, social protections, and so on, but from below. I wanted to address, I think, another element very innovative in these movements was the reflections on democracy in a quite pragmatic way, so in terms of trying to reconstitute different arenas in which participations and deliberation could happen. But at the same time, there were also movements that reflected a lot on the challenges that this type of prefigurative politics brought about. So the development from the squares into the parliaments, the anecdote that I was telling in the previous sessions about all my Spanish friends being now mayors, members of parliaments or members of the European parliaments even, testify for this type of unexpected move of some activist movements taking into account and opening up opportunities for themselves by occupying spaces which appeared as being emptied up by the same dynamic of the crisis. So if you take Syriza, which was already there but transformed itself a lot, if you take Podemos and Barcelona in Común and the other Marea Atlántica and the other party list which developed, or if you take also Corbyn or Sanders as phenomenon, or if you take the availability of movements to jump in referendums, like in Scotland, in Italy, there was this unexpected move of movements to occupy the empty spaces in representative politics as well. This doesn't mean that the development is without challenges. So I think that there are all these aspects of movements that tend to defend old rights, but also the fact that especially where protest was stronger, movements tended to take more anti-systemic characteristic, anti-systemic also in the sense of innovative.